To kick this week off, we're going to return to this concept of a Smarta tradition as a Sampradaya. So you have been exposed a little bit to Smarta traditions before, but here we're going to get more deeply into them. Now, before we begin with the Smarta, I also want to cover the fact that there are other Sampradaya, other streams. This includes Suryaism. So the Suryaites or Sauras are followers of a Hindu tradition or stream that started in the Vedic period and worshipped Surya as the main visible form of Saguna Brahman. The Surya tradition was influential especially in South Asia, particularly in the western and northern sections of the subcontinent, from about 800 to about 1000 of the common area. You see a lot of Surya temples being built. The Konark Sun Temple, for example, is another temple that's built in the mid-13th century, although according to Hindu sources, during the rise of the Sultanate's period, the Konark Temple is damaged, and that's recorded also by historian Andre Wink, who also asserts that it's destroyed. Although, again, that's according to Hindu sources, so there's a little bit of debate and contestation of that. In any case, another stream here that is quite prominent is Ganapatism. Ganapatism is a stream in which Ganesha is worshipped as the main form of Saguna Brahman in this particular stream. Ganapatism is widespread and influential, especially in Maharashtra, so a particular province in the subcontinent. Then another Sampradaya is the Shrauta Sampradaya. So Shrauta communities are a little bit rare in India in the present, but they're the most well known of certain groups in particular provinces. So they're sort of prominent among the Nambutiri Brahmins of Kerala province. So that would be in the especially in the southwest. They follow the Purva Mimamsa, for example, an earlier portion of the Vedas, in contrast to Vedanta, followed by other Brahmins. They also place importance on the performance of yajna, Vedic sacrifices. The Nambudiri Brahmins are famous for their preservation of Somayagam and also Agni Jayana rituals, which have vanished in other parts of the subcontinent. Another Sampradaya group here is the Kamaram, which is a stream of Hinduism especially found in South India and Sri Lanka, where Lord Murugan, that is Kartikaya, is the supreme deva in this particular stream. Lord Murugan is considered superior to the Trimurti, the Trimurti being a combination of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So being superior to that Trimurti is quite an assertion. The worshippers of Lord Murugan are generally called Kamaras, and this stream is prominent in Southeast Asia among Tamil populations in Southeast Asia as well. There's also a Hindu term for a group of essentially syncretic practitioners of Balinese religion. So Balinese religion and pre-colonial Javanese religion is frequently called Kajawan or Agama Kajawan or Agama Siwabut. And so this combines Shaivism and Buddhism. But in Hindu sources, from an external perspective, they tend to refer to this as the Buddha Sampradaya. And that term is sometimes picked up in Dutch colonial ethnography accounts of Brahmana, Varna, Balinese Hindu practitioners, but this is not specifically Hinduism, it's that syncretic blend of Shaivism and Buddhism. We'll see more of that later. But again, in Balinese, that's more frequently called Agama Siwaput. Now, to remind you, the Smarta tradition is a stream of Hinduism that developed during the classical period at the beginning of the Common Era, reflecting a synthesis of four major philosophical strands: the Mimamsa school, the Advaita school, the Yoga school, and Devaism, so the worship of gods, right? Sometimes called theism, but Devaism would be a more appropriate way to describe that. The Smarta tradition rejects the notion that there is a division among the various Deva streams, and it's notable for the domestic worship of 5 shrines and 5 Devas, all treated as equal: Shiva, Vishnu, Surya, Ganesha, and Shakti. They're all the same. They're understood to be the same, different manifestations of the exact same force. The Smarta tradition contrasts, therefore, with older Shrauta traditions that we have previously discussed, which were based upon elaborate rituals and rites. They sort of simplified the rituals and rites. There has been considerable overlap in the ideas and practices of the Smarta tradition with other streams of Hinduism. So it overlaps sort of in a complex Venn diagram that has 4 or 5 parts with Shaivism, Brahmanism, Vaishnavism, and Shaktivism. Now, if you will recall, the Smarta tradition is aligned with Advaita Vedanta and regards Adi Shankara as its sort of founder or reformer. Advaita Sampradaya is not a Shaiva stream, however, despite the historical links with Shaivism. Advaitins are also explicitly rejecting the notion that there's any type of distinction amongst these schools, and explicitly reject the notion of sectarianism, meaning that occasionally in specific periods you might have an individual who sort of says, levels accusations are pure forms or this kind of thing, saying that Shaivism is like the most true form of Hinduism, even though the other forms are still recognized. It's not like accusing the other of being heretical, but saying like, this is the most true. But this particular Smarta tradition specifically rejects even that, holding all streams, every single stream of Hinduism, as having value, and therefore becomes prominent. Furthermore, Smarta traditions combine streams syncretically and advocate the worship of Shaiva, Vishnu equally, and all other deities in Hinduism, all other deva like Shakti manifestations, Ganapati manifestations, all treated as equals. Shankara championed the notion that the ultimate reality is interpersonal, and nirguna, the idea that deva could have attributes, or are devoid of attributes rather, is promoted. So there's saguna, which is the notion that deva can have attributes, and nirguna, which is the rejection that deva have attributes. So there's no notion that there's a symbolic God. There's just this notion of a sort of universal belief. This is an inspiring belief in that Smarta tradition followers form along 5 different Hindu gods, and then fold in the 6th notion of an interpersonal sort of universal deva. And the tradition has been described by others as a sort of, I would say inaccurately, as monist or monotheistic, but is not explicitly monism the way that you find monist traditions in, for example, pre-colonial China. especially Han Dynasty China. So that being said, just be aware that it's sometimes described by secondary scholars as monist. It's more sort of like a universalist stream. The term Smarta also refers to Brahmins who specialize in the Smriti corpus of texts named the Grihya Sutras, in contrast to the Srauta Sutras. So in the discussion of Nirguna versus Saguna, the concept of Para-Brahman is incredibly important. Para-Brahman is the notion of a sort of supreme Brahman, that in which is described as a sort of universal, descriptionless essence. It is formless in the sense that it is devoid of Maya, that it eternally pervades everything, becoming and simultaneously creating everything, everywhere in the universe and whatever is beyond the universe. Para-Brahman is conceptualized in diverse ways. So, for example, in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, Para-Brahman is a synonym of Nirguna Brahman, the attributeless and the absolute. Conversely, in the Dvaita Vedanta and the Vishisht Advaita Vedanta traditions, the Para-Brahman is defined as a Saguna Brahman, which means that it is absolute, but it has attributes. In Vaishnavism, Shaivism, Shaktism, each of these sort of various streams, Vishnu, Shiva, and Shakti are respectively described as the Para-Brahman. So, for example, Mahaganapati is considered the Para-Brahman by the Ganapatiya stream. Kartikaya is considered the Para-Brahman by the Kartikaya stream. In Advaita Vedanta, however, the Para-Brahman is defined as Nirguna Brahman, or Brahman without form or qualities, a state of complete knowledge of self as being identical with a transcendental Brahman, a state of mental, spiritual enlightenment, or jnana yoga. It contrasts, therefore, with this notion of Saguna Brahman quite distinctly. Advaita Vedanta is non-dualistic in it that it holds that Brahman is sort of universally divine, and all things and essences that are divine are sort of universally Brahman, and that's identical to that which is the Atman, or one's notion of the self, the innermost self. This is also simultaneously attributeless, infinite, all essences of love, truth, knowledge, and being, consciousness, bliss are part of this understanding. The Bhagavata Purana gives us the understanding that learned transcendentalists who know the absolute truth call this non-dual substance Brahman, Paramatma, or Bhagavan. In closing here, you may recall that the Grihya Sutras are a very specific form of sutra text, a category of sort of later Vedic period texts classified as belonging to the Kalpa Sutra literature of the Vedanga, and therefore as Smriti, which deals with the proper performance of domestic rituals, specifically Grihya Yajnas, as well as containing details of various rites of passage, samskaras, such as Vedic initiation, Upanayana, as well as marriage and death ceremonies, and the description of day-to-day religious concerns from the perspective of the householder, so Grihastha. The Grihya Sutra's content, therefore, overlaps to some extent with that of the Dharma Sutras. On the slide here, this is from a digital rare books collection. You have a portrayal of a scene as instructed by the Grihya Sutras of rules of conduction of Vedic domestic ceremonies, specifically as translated by Herman Oldenburg and published by Clarendon Press in Oxford in 1886. And it's illustrated by an illustrator who's hired to make this illustration. The Grihya Sutras, together with the Smarta Sutras, with which they contrast, and the Dharma Sutras, make up this total of the Kalpa Sutra tradition. So when you contrast the Smarta tradition with Bhaktism, another stream, in the second day this week, just remember the Grihya Sutras as being the sort of foundational text that this stream of Adi Sankara is getting back to.